in a foreign country. But I don't know that. I should check this. But the point that this question brings out is that this jurisprudence is basically dealing with how one protects civilians from the violence of war. There's another part, and I want to talk about this with the Red Cross in a moment, is how one protects soldiers from the violence of war and prisoners from the violence of war, which is a second question. And so that's the juridical part. There's a humanitarian part, which also gets carried over into law, which is we talked about last time with the Red Cross. Now, the Red Cross, then, is this creation of this agency, which is recognized in international law, which says that human rights of a certain sort enters into war, and reflects a kind of neutral humanitarianism incumbent upon all states to maintain. It's about mitigating the violence of war as an instrument of politics. So what the Red Cross is doing is enforcing rules about, for example, the treatment of prisoners. No, you cannot starve prisoners of war. No, you can't kill prisoners of war. Yes, you have to treat prisoners of war as human beings, so give them the right to communicate. Red Cross deals with letters with the prisoners of war. Red Cross monitors certain sorts of war practices, for example, use of poison gas and other sorts of violation that was taken to be international rules. Yes?
Why do they draw the line at, like, you're allowed to take prisoners of war, but then you have to treat them well?
Well, it's an interesting question. Why are you allowed to take prisoners of war but you have to treat them well? Again, it comes down to this whole jurisprudence from this, well, at least a large part of this jurisprudence. Part is about military discipline, what soldiers can and can't do just to keep them in line. The important question you ask is, why can you take prisoners and you have to treat them decently? Once someone becomes a prisoner of war, they're no longer a combatant. They're no longer a danger to you. And you have to treat them, essentially, the rule is actually to treat them like you treat your own. Now, that's a high standard, and I think probably few states do, but you have to feed them properly. Right? So in other words, a prisoner of war is no longer a combatant. But all of these codes of war say if a prisoner of war acts in a hostile way, if a prisoner of war attacks a guard, they can be shot on sight. They become like a soldier again. So all of this material is trying to, and all of this debate in the world today is what counts as a combatant and what doesn't count as a combatant. War is, after all, about killing combatants. And all of these rules are about not killing people who aren't combatants. Does that help? That's the notion. So of course you keep prisoners to keep them from being combatants again. But starving prisoners to death, as the Nazis did in the Second World War with the Russians, is a war crime, and they were charged with a war crime. I mean, we know that they systematically starved these guys to death. Likewise, in the former Yugoslavia, it's a war crime. So yes, you can capture them. No, you can't treat them indecently by these rules, illegally. So the Red Cross then it sort of became the monitor, if you will, of those parts of the international human rights law which dealt with the rights of prisoners and with, importantly, in all sorts of respects. And was meant to be radically neutral in how it did it, apolitical in how it did it. And the Red Cross also was reports on these kinds of violations of prohibited military actions, prohibited military modalities. Okay, so I've talked about what's a war crime already. So that's kind of the model, right? You divvy up what counts as war and what doesn't count as war, and a set of jurisprudence, first national and international, develops to monitor it. That's where we are now? Okay. Now let's talk about the problems with this. I thought I had on the outline, but I didn't. Somehow missed it on the. I wanted to be sure you have two terms down. I think somehow they didn't get on this PowerPoint, but one is use ad bellum. And the other is jus in bellum. I don't know what happened to this. Sorry? In bello. It's always said bellum. You're right. Thank you. I don't think it's written this way, but I will. Chris, you're looking for. So the distinction here, let me just, I've already suggested to you, but just be sure you know this. This is about the theory of just war. When is it justified to go to war? Which, as you know, is much in the news, right? That's before the war. This is the rules, what I've been talking to you about mostly in the rules in the war, the laws that govern in the war. If this were an international relations class, I'd talk much more, or at least as much, about the rules ad bellum. When is a nation justified in going to war? And clearly they're connected, because for there to be justice in war, the war has to itself be just. Though you could have an unjust war, jurists have said, even if it's an unjust war, or proves to be an unjust war, you still have to follow the rules in war. But just to have conceptually clear, what I've been talking about, justice in war. Right? All right. So, let's talk about the issue of civil war. Well, I told you the American Civil War was a war in which, by and large, these sides treated themselves as if they were sovereign nations and followed what were a developing jurisprudence of war. In general, this is not the case with civil war, and the more ideologically passionate the Civil War, or the more ethnically inflected the Civil War, the less likely that these rules, the more difficult it is to enforce these rules. So let me give you a history example. In the French Revolutionary Wars, the people in an area of western France called the Vendée, area around Brittany, refused basically to go along with the de-Christianization program of the French revolutionaries, and set up a rebellion. The French revolutionary government saw this not just as another group of people they were fighting a civil war with, but basically they were fighting for their survival. And if these people in the Vendée triumph, the revolution would end, and they, the revolutionaries, would perish. They were in the context of a foreign war in which France was being attacked by counter-revolutionary forces, and they treated these people in the Vendée as if they were existential enemies. And about 150,000 people were murdered in the Vendée to purge France of counter-revolution and priestcraft. So you see here, again, when religion comes in, it becomes existential. This is insignia for the royalist insurgents in the Vendée. We're fighting for God is the king, not the God is sovereign, not the revolutionaries. So in these existential civil wars, it's very hard to enforce, or the rules of war become nugatory. The other great example of this collapse is in the French Revolutionary Wars in Spain, which occasioned Goya to paint his famous pictures on the horrors of war. It's also the context in which the word guerrilla was founded, guerrilla being Spanish for small war. These were the small wars of ordinary people against the French conquerors, who were then treated as if they were not civilians and not enemy combatants under these rules, but as something